Hello and welcome to our next sociology video. This one is all about the use of interviews. And as we already know, there's two types of interviews. There's structured interviews and there's unstructured interviews. Structured interviews use closed-ended questions, so they're the same every time that the sociologist does the interview. They then produce quantitative data, because it's numerical in format. Because it's closed-ended, the sociologist just counts up the different answers, and from that produces the quantitative data. Therefore, it's more likely to be reliable, and therefore it's more likely to be used by positivists. On the other hand, unstructured interviews use open-ended questions, and it's much more like a conversation between the sociologist or the interviewer and the research participant. Also, the data that they produce is qualitative. It's like letters, it's words. Therefore, it's people responding in their own words, so that's going to increase the validity of the data, and therefore it's more likely to be used by interpretivists. Both structured and unstructured interviews have different strengths and limitations, and this is what we're now going to take a look at. So looking at structured interviews use pre-coded answers. So the ticky box ones. So pre-coded answers means that the sociologist has fixed the different categories ahead of time. This is useful because it means that the data analysis can be quick and it can be objective. The sociologist isn't having to decide what category the answers best go in. So, pre-coded answers enables quick and objective analysis. So this links to this picture here, which is about sort of the quantitative data that's generated. The quantitative data is useful for sociologists who are positivists. The sociologist comes up with the different categories, people tick which answers they believe apply to them. This then means that the data generated is reliable, so it can be done several different times with the same results being produced. So reliability, again, we know is prized by positivists, it's the interpretivists who like the valid data, but because the sociologist is deciding what the answers are going to be, they're imposing their version of reality onto other people. And we know that this is called the imposition problem. We saw it with closed-ended questionnaires. So the sociologist decides what the possible answers may be, and by doing that takes away people's ability to answer in their own words. Now, because structured interviews are quick, it means that you can generally get a larger sample. If you have a larger sample, it's more likely to be representative. Just put a rep for representative. And the other good thing about them is that you can make them quite ethical. There's certain topics that perhaps you should avoid talking about in a structured interview with the fear of it possibly causing psychological harm. However, they can be honest and open, people give their consent to take part, they can maintain privacy and confidentiality so people can remain anonymous, and there's no real legal issues of which to speak. However, there's some downsides of using structured interviews aside from the imposition problem. Firstly, because they're quite sort of formal, it's a formal interview, people may not relax, and when people relax, they're more likely to open up and tell people about their real lives. So the formality of the situation may cause people to say things or act differently than how they normally would. Another issue is, how do you know if the person's lying? In sociology, with all of these different methods, what we've got to be careful of is social desirability effect. Social desirability effect is where people act differently or behave differently or say different things because they want to impress the person who's interviewing them. So we've got the formality of the situation, the fact that people may lie, and how do you know? But also we've got something called interviewer bias. So the interviewer, although they're supposed to do the interviews the same way every time, may sort of prejudge people, and without knowing it, those prejudgments may then affect the way that they phrase the questions, ask the questions, the emphasis that they put on the participants' answers, and that again will affect how the sort of interactions occur between the research participant and the researcher. So, the last thing for us to look at is issues with the use of unstructured interviews. Unstructured interviews, remember, produce qualitative data, so therefore are preferred by interpretivists because they like valid data. Sorry, that sentence didn't make sense. So unstructured interviews produce qualitative data, preferred by interpretivists because they want valid data. There we go. So on here we've got some similar sort of pictures to think about. So firstly, again, they're quite useful in an ethical sense. You can maintain privacy and confidentiality. You can be honest and open with people. And also, because you're going to be talking to that person for a long while, you can establish what we call a rapport, which is what this picture means. It's like a trust. So if the research participant trusts the sociologist, they're more likely to be honest and open. It's only when you have a report that you can ask about sensitive issues. So, two sociologists, Dobash and Dobash, they both used unstructured interviews when they were researching domestic violence and women's accounts of domestic violence. So they spoke to these women and they built a relationship with them, and then these women felt safe enough to share with them their experiences. However, the downside is that they are very time consuming, so it takes a long time to do the interviews. So there was a sociologist called Martins, and he researched New Age travellers, and some of his interviews lasted up to 4 hours. They also require some subjective interpretation of data. So subjective interpretation of data means that it might not be reliable. One sociologist might categorise things in a different way to another sociologist. However, the data generated tends to be more valid. The reason why the data tends to be more valid is because there's a certain amount of flexibility, so the sociologist can ask follow-up questions. If someone mentions something that they've perhaps not thought about, they can ask them, oh, can you explain that? And because of that, they can get to the heart of the issue. This flexibility, like I said, enables a sociologist to see how people live their lives. So that sentence, you can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. The sociologist can really empathise with the research participant, and that leads to Verstehen, understanding why people do as they do. We've got a couple of other pictures that need to be talked about. Another strength is about accessing groups who may otherwise be ignored. So we've already seen that questionnaires and structured interviews might not be ideal for using with certain groups of people. So questionnaires you can't really use with people who can't read, people who can't speak English, people, I can't remember the other group children. Whereas an unstructured interview, because you've got that ability to build rapport, people then might be more likely to talk. So Laboff tried to use structured interviews to research young children and their linguistic abilities, their abilities to speak. And he tried to use structured interviews, but the children just got very nervous and very clammed up. So what he then did was he did his research again, but this time he used unstructured interviews. He sat on the floor with the children, he allowed them to have friends there and toys, and they would play for a bit, and then he would start asking them questions. And this enabled him to research a group who otherwise might have been ignored. However, we've got some similar weaknesses. We've also got, as with structured interviews, we've also got the social desirability effect, SDE. So people may lie because they want to impress the sociologist. And it might not be that they're lying because they're ashamed of something. It might be that they're lying because they want to impress. The other thing that we've got is that, again, we've got interviewer bias. The interviewer may prejudge the situation and then ask questions which leads the research participant to talk about certain things. So they might have a fixed idea in their head of the person that they're talking to, so ask them questions which then makes that person give answers which matches their preconceptions. A sort of one that I've got here is just that the research participants are answering in their own words, and it is much more like a conversation. People are at ease, so we could say that improves the validity of the data. However, on the sort of flip side, the data collected then becomes quite subjective. So different sociologists wouldn't necessarily get the same information. And because of that seemed to be a limitation of unstructured interviews. So that's the end of this little video. If you need to watch it again, please do so. If not, well done.